My new book, Harlem Nocturne, Women Artists and Progressive Politics During World War II, focuses on three African-American women in the 1940s during the period during the war and immediately after. The three women are the novelist Ann Petry, the choreographer dancer Pearl Primus, and the composer pianist Mary Lou Williams. They were all innovative artists, but they were also very politically engaged during the period. Harlem had come through the Depression, and the Depression brought with it a kind of radical politics that had always been there, but that really became more prominent as people tried to address the sort of economic devastation that the community suffered. So we have the remains of that kind of radical politics in the 1940s, but also a new sense of possibility as the country goes to war, a war for democracy, a war against fascism. African Americans begin to press for their own rights, and Harlem is central to that. I think Harlem will always be central to African American life, if only because of its significance historically. So movement really sort of, the very notion of movement basically gives the book its own momentum. And I think about movement in a number of ways. One, because we often think of the civil rights movement or the Black freedom movement as kind of culminating or having, its biggest time in the 60s, or maybe from the Montgomery bus boycott through the 1960s. And what I wanted to do is extend that sense into the 40s to show that many of the things that we think of, that we associate with the 50s and 60s, boycotts and freedom rides and sit-ins, were actually starting in the 1940s. And these women were very much aware that they were of taking part in a movement. It was a political movement that gave them a sort of sense of purpose and a vocabulary and a set of goals. And so that definition of movement is very important. But as a scholar who's an interdisciplinary scholar, I always try to look for something that lets me talk about different forms together, because it's hard to talk about dance with music, with writing. And all three of those forms, movement is very important. So Harlem Nocturne was completely shaped by my being at the Institute for Research in African American Studies, with my colleagues, with its location, so close to many of the institutions that I write about, its location so close to the Schomburg, where I discovered much of the information that's in the book. But it was really my conversations with colleagues like the late Dr. Manning Marable that helped shape the emphasis on politics in Harlem Nocturne. I don't know that while politics would have always been a part of it, I don't think that it would have been as central had I not been engaged in those intellectual conversations. These women definitely had an impact on feminism, even when they weren't consciously trying to do so. I think Ann Petry, the novelist, was much more aware that she was also writing about gender issues in addition to racial and economic issues. She gives us characters who are facing problems that confront them because they're Black and because they're poor, but also because they're women. So she knows that she's kind of pushing that envelope. Mary Lou Williams is very much aware that she's a woman in a male-dominated field, but she's not calling attention to her difference. Instead, she's calling attention to her similarity, that she can compete in terms that are very kind of masculine terms. So I don't think that she's as conscious about being feminist in a way. She might even reject that. But because she is such a pioneer, she certainly is opening doors for women that would not have been opened without her. If there's one thing I wanted them to take away, is I'd want them to become familiar with these women. I want them to go and read something by Ann Petry, or go and listen to something by Mary Lou Williams, or know that, Pearl Primus is a very important choreographer and dancer who precedes Alvin Ailey. I would like for them to be familiar with these women and want to know more about them. There are many other things, but if there's just one thing, I just want them to know who these women were.